April 15th, 1943. 20,000 feet above the French coast, the morning sky shimmered with thin streaks of vapour trails. Below, the coastline near Dieppe was a quilt of grey mist and sunlit sea. Major Donald Blakesley of the US Army Air Forces tightened his gloved hand around the stick of his brand new Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The fighter trembled slightly, a monster of aluminum and horsepower. It was his first combat sortie in the type, a machine so heavy British pilots had laughed and called it the 7-ton milk bottle. But Blakesley was about to prove that this hulking brute was something far greater. Through the glare of the gun sight he saw movement in the clouds below, a flash of grey-green metal, a shape slicing through the haze. The distinct round wings and broad tail of a Focke-Wulf 190. The German fighter banked hard, unaware of the storm bearing down on it. Blakesley steadied the Thunderbolt, squeezed the trigger, and the sky erupted. 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns thundered in unison, sending a storm of metal across the air. Tracers converged, biting into the enemy plane. The German fighter disintegrated mid-turn, shattering into fire and debris. In that moment, the P-47 claimed its first aerial victory and air combat changed forever. The Thunderbolt was more than just a fighter. It was an industrial statement. Born from the mind of Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer with a passion for power over elegance, the P-47 defied European convention. Where German and British designers obsessed over lightness and agility, Kartveli built mass and muscle. He believed survivability, firepower and production mattered more than finesse. The result was an aircraft that could take punishment, deliver destruction, and fly home through a sky that would kill anything else. Its engine alone weighed nearly as much as an entire German fighter. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower radial, fed air through a massive turbo supercharger tucked in the fuselage, connected by ducts and pipes that gave the plane its bulky frame. German pilots would joke it looked like a flying oil drum, but those jokes ended when they saw what it could do. In its wings sat 8 Browning M2 heavy machine guns, each capable of 800 rounds per minute. Together they unleashed over 6,000 bullets per minute, enough metal to shred a locomotive. The Thunderbolt didn't nibble at the enemy, it devoured him, and it could do it again and again, with ammunition loads that dwarfed anything the Luftwaffe could dream of. At first, American pilots struggled to love their new mount. They'd come from the nimble Spitfire, graceful, light, elegant. The P-47 was none of those things. It was loud, heavy, and unforgiving. On takeoff, its torque could drag an inexperienced pilot off the runway. But in the air, once its power surged to life, it revealed its purpose: to dominate through endurance and firepower. In early 1943, the 4th Fighter Group, formed from former RAF Eagle Squadron veterans, took the Thunderbolt into combat for the first time. Radio issues plagued the opening missions, forcing the Americans to install British sets. But the flaws didn't matter once the guns began to speak. By April's end, the Luftwaffe's elite JG-26 Schlageter wing, the pride of German air defence, had lost several aircraft to Thunderbolt fire. German intelligence officers examined the wreckage of P-47s and refused to believe the reports. 8 heavy machine guns in one single-engine fighter. They dismissed it as American exaggeration. Yet reality was undeniable. The Thunderbolt's punch was unlike anything seen in aerial warfare. Each .50 caliber bullet carried enough energy to pierce armour, ignite fuel, or sever a wing spar. Fired in coordinated streams, they turned air combat from precision dueling into calculated saturation. A single 1-second burst could put more projectiles into the air than an entire squadron of Spitfires. The German Focke-Wulf 190 was formidable. 2 20mm cannons and twin machine guns gave it bite, but its ammunition supply was small, its rate of fire limited. Pilots were trained to conserve rounds, firing short surgical bursts. The Americans did the opposite. They fired for seconds at a time, hosing the sky with relentless fury. And behind every P-47 was not just a pilot, but an army of factories. At Republic Aviation's plant in Farmingdale, New York, production lines moved like clockwork. By spring 1943, one Thunderbolt rolled off the line every 4 hours. The factory never slept. Thousands of men and women, many of them recent immigrants or young mothers, assembled wings, engines, and gun mounts around the clock. It was mass production turned into art. The Lake City Army ammunition plant in Missouri matched that tempo. By mid-1943, it was producing over 1.5 billion rounds of .50 caliber ammunition per year, more than the entire German aircraft ammunition industry combined. Every bullet was identical to the last. Every link, every belt, every cartridge case was made to microscopic tolerances. If one gun failed, another could take its place without adjustment. This precision and scale, this fusion of standardization and abundance, became the real weapon of the P-47. The Luftwaffe was fighting not a machine, but a system. By summer, the results were undeniable. The Americans had unleashed a fighter that turned the sky into a factory floor, one where death was measured in units of production and victory was a matter of output. By the summer of 1943, the roar of the Thunderbolt had become the soundtrack of daylight war over Europe. Its vast engines snarled through thin air as formations of P-47s escorted bombers deep into German territory. From high above, the silver fuselages flashed in sunlight like a wall of armour. Below them, the Luftwaffe hunted in dwindling packs, daring to rise into a sky that no longer belonged to them. The Germans had built their air force on precision and discipline. Their fighters, sleek and efficient, were born from an age when craftsmanship still ruled the workshop. But now they faced an enemy powered by industry. The P-47 was not handcrafted. It was mass-produced, assembled by thousands of anonymous workers across America. Its strength lay not only in its guns, but in the system that fed it, an industrial heartbeat that never stopped. At its core was the principle of abundance. Each P-47 carried 2,800 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, 10 times what most German fighters brought to battle. The Browning machine gun, a weapon perfected by standardization, fired with clockwork precision. Its disintegrating belt links vanished in flight, leaving nothing but the storm. German pilots, trained to conserve every bullet, now faced opponents who could pour continuous streams of fire without fear of running dry. In the air, the difference was staggering. German fighters, running short on fuel and ammunition, had seconds to strike. American Thunderbolts could hold the trigger for half a minute and still have enough to fight their way home. Each burst of tracers formed an unbroken beam of light, a visual embodiment of industrial power. The Luftwaffe's engineers were stunned when they examined captured P-47 parts. Every component fit perfectly into every other gun, no hand-fitting required. It was engineering turned into mathematics. Where German factories struggled with inconsistent alloys and sabotage, the American production line ran on precision and pride. Every bullet, every bolt was identical. For the first time in aviation history, firepower itself became a doctrine. The Thunderbolt didn't win because it was elegant. It won because it was inevitable. It didn't need to outturn the Focke-Wulf. It needed only to survive long enough to bring its guns to bear. One burst, 1 second, and the fight was over. But abundance carried challenges of its own. The early P-47s could only escort bombers partway across France before fuel forced them home. Beyond that line, the B-17 and B-24s were left alone. German controllers learned to wait. They'd watch the American escorts turn back, then unleash their fighters in coordinated swarms. On August 17, 1943, during the Regensburg-Schweinfurt mission, 60 American bombers were shot down in a single day. It was a devastating price for daylight precision bombing, but it proved something vital. Within the Thunderbolt's reach, bombers survived. The answer came, as always, from industry. Engineers fitted drop tanks beneath the wings, first 75-gallon, then 108-gallon, and eventually 150-gallon tanks that stretched range by hundreds of miles. Aluminum and rubber became as strategic as bullets. With each innovation, the P-47's protective reach grew deeper into occupied Europe. By autumn, they were accompanying bombers to targets 400 miles from base. The Luftwaffe's safe zones vanished. The industrial machine behind them worked with mechanical rhythm. At forward airfields in England, ground crews operated like factory teams under open sky. Ammunition trucks arrived hourly. Spare engines sat on pallets, ready to replace any that failed. A damaged Thunderbolt could be stripped and rebuilt within days. The Germans, starved of materials and forced to scavenge parts, sometimes waited weeks to return a single aircraft to flight. On both sides, pilots began to understand that the war in the air had become a contest of endurance, not finesse. The Luftwaffe could still field extraordinary machines, the Focke-Wulf 190, the Messerschmitt 109, but their numbers and their pilots were dwindling. Fuel shortages meant training was cut short. Many young German airmen went into combat after barely 100 flight hours. American pilots arrived in Europe with 4 times that experience and unlimited ammunition to hone their aim. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, who would become one of America's leading aces, described the difference with blunt simplicity. "We didn't need to be perfect shots. We just needed to keep the sight steady and pull the trigger. The guns did the rest." As 1943 turned to 1944, the Thunderbolt's role expanded beyond air-to-air combat. Its guns, designed to shred aircraft, proved equally lethal against the ground. Pilots discovered that armor-piercing incendiary rounds could rip through trains, trucks, and tanks. In a shallow dive, the P-47 could unleash 1,000 rounds in 10 seconds, enough to destroy an entire railway line in one pass. German supply convoys became easy prey, locomotives exploded, bridges collapsed, and the arteries of the Wehrmacht's logistics began to bleed. The devastation wasn't only physical, the psychological toll was immense. The sight, or even the sound, of diving Thunderbolts sent German troops scrambling for cover. The aircraft's distinctive whistle, caused by air rushing through its cooling ducts, became infamous. To soldiers on the ground, it was the sound of doom, a shrieking herald of destruction that struck without warning. By D-Day, the Thunderbolt was everywhere. On June 6, 1944, as Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, over 2,000 P-47 sorties filled the sky. They destroyed trains, convoys, gun batteries, anything that moved. In the chaos of invasion, they became flying artillery, erasing targets faster than ground forces could report them. German pilots barely managed 300 sorties that day. The Americans flew 13,000. The balance of power in the sky was no longer in question. Even as the Luftwaffe's factories reached their peak production in late 1944, the effort was hollow. There were no pilots, no fuel, and no hope of matching American quantity. For every German fighter built, 2 Thunderbolts rolled from the assembly line, each backed by limitless ammunition and a maintenance system that functioned like an assembly line at war. It was not just a contest of machines, it was a contest of civilization. Germany's air force had been built on scarcity and genius, America's on abundance and discipline. One crafted its weapons as art, the other stamped them by the thousands, and in modern war it was the factory, not the artist, that determined who ruled the skies. By the closing months of 1944, the sky over Europe belonged to the factory floor. The Luftwaffe was still deadly in fragments, but its dominance had dissolved into desperation. Pilots flew with dwindling fuel, their aircraft often patched together from the remains of others. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and, perhaps worst of all, outsupplied. The American Thunderbolt, heavy and relentless, had become more than a weapon. It was an ecosystem of power. In the air, German pilots still fought bravely. The Focke-Wulf 190 remained a formidable opponent, agile and fast, but it was a weapon built for an era that no longer existed. The Thunderbolt had rewritten the rules. It didn't need to dance with its enemy. It simply absorbed punishment, rolled into position, and unleashed firepower that obliterated anything in its path. Those 8 Browning .50 caliber guns spoke with the voice of American industry. Every tracer line, every glowing streak of light that cut through the sky, carried with it the labour of thousands of unseen hands across an ocean. Factory workers, machinists, and engineers who never saw combat but whose precision made victory possible. The Thunderbolt's durability became legend. Pilots returned with holes punched clean through their wings, hydraulic systems shredded, engines burning oil, and still they landed. Colonel Robert S. Johnson once flew home with over 200 bullet holes in his plane, canopy shattered, controls barely functioning. When he stepped out of the cockpit, he looked back at the mangled hulk and simply said, "She brought me home." That sentence became the Thunderbolt's epitaph. By late 1944, the numbers were staggering. Republic Aviation's plants were producing over 400 Thunderbolts a month. The Lake City ammunition plant was manufacturing more rounds of 50 caliber ammunition than the entire German aircraft industry produced of all calibers combined. Every bullet that left an American gun was a mathematical certainty. The system worked with mechanical precision. Where the Luftwaffe had once relied on ace pilots to compensate for inferior numbers, now those aces were gone, lost to attrition, captured, or simply exhausted. Their replacements were teenagers with barely 100 hours of flight time, facing opponents who had fired more rounds in training than they would in their entire careers. The American pilot was not fighting alone. Behind him stood a machine that spanned continents, spare engines shipped in crates, replacement wings pre-assembled, ammunition loaded in belts miles long. Maintenance crews could rebuild a fighter overnight. German mechanics, under constant bombardment, worked by lantern light, cannibalizing wrecks for parts that no longer fit. The outcome was not determined in the clouds, but in the factories below. When the jet-powered Me-262 appeared, it seemed for a moment as though the Luftwaffe might reclaim the skies. It was faster, futuristic, a glimpse of what could have been. But speed meant little without support. The jet's powerful cannons carried limited ammunition, 80 to 100 rounds per gun, and their low muzzle velocity made them nearly useless in turning fights. They were predators without prey, hunted by thunderbolts that attacked their airfields before they could take off. Even technology could not save a nation running on empty. The numbers tell a story of arithmetic warfare. By the end of the conflict, more than 15,000 P-47s had been built. They flew nearly 750,000 sorties, destroyed almost 4,000 enemy aircraft in the air, and tens of thousands more on the ground. They annihilated trains, trucks, tanks, and bridges, strangling Germany's ability to move. Entire rail networks vanished under their guns. Every column of smoke that rose from a German locomotive marked another artery of the Reich cut open by American firepower. But beyond statistics lay something deeper, the transformation of war itself. The P-47 represented not just a machine, but a philosophy. That victory belonged to those who could mass-produce excellence faster than the enemy could perfect genius. It was the triumph of system over skill, logistics over legend. The Luftwaffe had been built on artistry and courage. The Americans replaced both with process and precision. It was not poetry, it was arithmetic. On the ground, German soldiers came to fear the Thunderbolt more than any bomber. Its distinctive shriek as it dived, the whistle of air tearing through gun ports, became a sound burned into the collective memory of Europe. Survivors described it as a monster's roar, the prelude to destruction. Columns of tanks disappeared in single passes, fields erupted in flame, and villages trembled as these armoured angels of the sky turned battlefields into industrial slaughterhouses. And still, the assembly lines rolled on. At Republic's Farmingdale plant, women made up nearly half the workforce. They built Thunderbolts with precision unheard of before the war, measuring tolerances by thousandths of an inch, their hands steady from repetition. At the Lake City ammunition plant, inspectors rejected any bullet even slightly off-spec. In those factories, democracy became a production system, and the war became a numbers game the Axis could never win. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was collapsing under the weight of that realization. German pilots began avoiding combat altogether, conserving fuel for missions that never came. The airfields that once launched their elite squadrons were cratered moonscapes, their aircraft burned or abandoned. The Thunderbolts roamed freely, attacking everything that moved. For them, there were no longer fronts, only targets. The industrial imbalance was absolute. American air groups carried enough ammunition to fight for 30 days without resupply. German units often had enough for 3. The Americans rotated veterans home to train new pilots. The Germans flew until they died. What had begun as a battle for air superiority ended as a war of extinction, a slow grinding away of skill, courage, and ideology under a flood of mechanized fire. When the war finally ended, the numbers were undeniable. For every Thunderbolt lost, several enemy aircraft had fallen. The kill ratio, nearly 5-to-1, told a story not just of performance, but of philosophy. The Thunderbolt's dominance came not from any single advantage, but from the totality of the system that supported it: training, logistics, standardization, and the endless hum of American production lines. Historians would later call it the industrialization of air power. The P-47 was its first complete expression. It was proof that machines could embody the will of a nation. Every burst of its guns was a message from the assembly lines of Detroit, Buffalo, and St. Louis, a declaration that mass production could conquer even the most disciplined enemies. The German pilots who survived knew it too. Many wrote after the war that facing a formation of Thunderbolts was like facing a wall of fire. Heinz Knock, one of the Luftwaffe's aces, described it as fighting against a nation, not an airplane. His words captured the truth. The P-47 wasn't just an aircraft, it was America itself, airborne and unstoppable. When the shooting stopped, the legacy remained. The Thunderbolt had proven that air combat had entered a new era. No longer would small numbers of elite pilots decide wars through skill and daring. Victory would belong to those who could build, maintain, and supply faster than the enemy could react. The P-47's DNA lived on in every jet that followed. The F-86 Sabre, the F-4 Phantom, the F-15 Eagle. All descendants of a philosophy born in the skies of 1943. Even decades later, veterans would recall the sensation of flight inside the massive machine. The vibration of the radial engine, the thunder of 8 guns firing together, the smell of cordite and oil. It was a symphony of power, industrial, relentless, and utterly American. The P-47 Thunderbolt did not win through grace. It won through endurance, through firepower, through the cold efficiency of a nation that had learned how to turn factories into weapons. Its guns did not sing, they roared. And in that roar was the sound of a world transformed, a sound that told every enemy that the future of war belonged not to the duelist, but to the producer. The Thunderbolt's 8 guns were more than instruments of destruction. They were the voice of an era. They spoke of assembly lines that never slept, of workers who built through exhaustion, of an industrial democracy that turned steel and sweat into air supremacy. They were the rhythm of a war machine that believed in quantity, precision, and persistence above all else. And so, when the final victory came, it was not just a triumph of pilots or planes, but of a philosophy, that in the age of total war, courage alone was not enough. What mattered was the system behind the trigger, the nation that could feed its guns forever. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the first to prove it. Its thunder still echoes in the doctrine of every modern air force, in every missile and machine built to project power through endless supply. It was not beautiful, but it was eternal. The sound of its guns was the sound of inevitability.